can just talk a little broadly about the perspective, kind of principles that you think animate Joe Biden's foreign policy worldview.
Sure, and thanks, Peter, and it's great to be on with the other panelists and here with Jewish Currents, which is a great magazine that I love. So in broad terms, I mean, I'll start, I think it's safe to say I think Biden represents, you know, a more establishment foreign policy view. He's been, you know, as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That's really one of his areas of key focus. So he has, you know, a large contingent around him who've been doing this work for a long time. Am I coming through?
Yes.
Okay. So I think there's been some criticisms, you know, I'm not going to dwell on the negative here, but let's just get this out of the way. I think there's been he's kind of struggled to engage with some of the criticisms about the Iraq war, and to really show that he has grappled with the consequences of that war and the consequences of that vote. Now, having said that, he was part of the Obama administration. He played a major role in foreign policy during the Obama administration. He was, in fact, on some of the less interventionist side or the more restraint-oriented side of a number of important debates within the Obama administration, like on the Afghanistan surge, like on Libya. And I think that is really worth recognizing. I think he has shown that he changes his views in response to events and engages with some of the rising debates. So I think that provides an opportunity to continue to engage with him and his team, as I hope and expect progressives will continue to do. You know, one very positive aspect here, and I think this is reflective of the way the Democratic Party is moving more generally, is Biden's commitment to rejoin the Iran nuclear agreement, which is a commitment he shared with every Democratic primary candidate. But also to seek broader diplomacy with Iran with regard to, you know, the kind of, you know, Iran's role in the region, the Iran-Saudi conflict, and what that means for America's continuing role in the region. And, you know, for those of us, you know, like Lara and myself and you and others who kind of labored in these fields of Middle East policy for some time in Washington, the idea that the Democratic Party is pretty strongly unified behind a pro-diplomacy with Iran position is no small thing. It's a really positive thing. So I think that's worth recognizing. I think the details of that diplomacy will have to be watched very closely. But I think we've seen Biden signal, I think it was the November primary debate where he went on a very long kind of, you know, he made a number of remarks with regard to Saudi Arabia's behavior and making them a pariah because of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the bombing of Yemen. So I think, you know, he is into the idea of kind of reorienting or reassessing the US posture in the region. So I think there's very much something to work with. And I would just, a last point, and I think this kind of helps us pivot into the Israel-Palestine piece for when we want to do that. Biden was also supportive of my boss's Yemen War Powers resolution, coming out strongly in support of that. There were a number of former Obama administration officials who were supportive of that, and recognizing, you know, in retrospect, that support for the Saudi war was a mistake, and understanding that the context of their support for the Saudi intervention was sort of seen as a way of kind of chilling the Saudis out because of their upset over the Iran nuclear agreement, and the recognition that the Yemenis are the ones who ultimately had to pay the price, or were forced to pay a price for this this diplomacy with Iran. And I think pivoting now to the issue of Palestine is, you know, we'll need to work hard and make sure that the Palestinians are not the ones who have to pay a price for the broader effort at regional diplomacy that I expect Biden would pursue as president. So I'll just stop there.
That's great. Ida, I want to come to you in a minute, but before we do, I want to just get Lara to give her take. I think that was a kind of a glass half full assessment by Matt, talking about kind of Biden's evolution on foreign policy, his support for the Iran deal, his support for Senator Sanders' effort to end U.S. participation in the war on Yemen, the fact that he actually was on the more dovish side of certain internal Obama administration debates. Is that the way you see it? What would you add in terms of his Middle East foreign policy in general, beyond just Israel-Palestine?
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Jewish Currents and the panel. Look, I don't disagree with anything that Matt laid out. I think it's important. I think it's important to look at Mr. Biden in the context of the whole policy, and let's be clear. Nobody or very few people are going to be choosing to vote for a given candidate in this election based on their Israel-Palestine policy. There are such huge things at stake. And beyond that, that's never been an issue that has been decisive. American progressives, progressive American Jews in particular, vote for Democrats because of the whole array of issues, not because Israel-Palestine is at the top of their agenda. And historically, even under the Obama administration, successive Democratic administrations have actually been to the right of most of the American Jewish community and of most progressive Americans on Israel-Palestine. I think that looking, and I don't want to say it's looking at the glass half empty, but realistically, the Biden campaign has pretty much made clear so far that they don't want to be bogged down on Israel-Palestine making this an issue. The statements they have made, the way they have articulated issues so far, which is of course very disappointing to me. I'd love to see more constructive, more courageous, more visionary thoughts, particularly at a time when Israel is getting set to do something like annex. And on the heels of a Trump administration, which has shattered all existing US policy. But essentially what they've articulated is as close to a status quo, don't upset the apple cart, we'll deal with things as they happen, we're solid, we're gonna, give the rhetoric of progressives just like every other previous administration has, and we're not gonna shake things up. And look, the folks who oppose Biden on Israel-Palestine on the right will say, don't believe them, they're gonna go there and they're gonna be tough and anti-Israel and they're gonna be worse than Obama. And the folks on the left say, look at what they're saying and take them at their word. I think we don't know. I think this election is not going to be decided on Israel-Palestine. I do think it's clear, though, given how far things have moved in very dangerous directions in the past, not just 3 years, but the past 20 years. The past 3 years are the sort of coming together of all of that and cherry on the sundae. But given how the direction things have gone, how badly they have gone, and given all of the things that are at stake in this election, I think we're going to have to wait to see after an election what an administration will actually do. And I think that anyone who is hoping for a Biden administration to come in and save the Palestinians, I think one should take a breath, because no progressive candidate, no president from either party has ever come in and said, I am going to be the one who will come in with great visionary and change everything. Mr. Obama didn't say he would do that, and he came in and really didn't even meet the expectations of people who thought he might surprise them. So I think there's an opportunity here to look at where things are, and I don't mean to sound snarky, but I will say I think it is useful to look at what the Biden campaign has said and the people around the Biden campaign and say, this is a reminder, there is no savior here. If the savior is going to come from anywhere, it's going to come from grassroots pushing their elected officials at every level. It's not a man who is going to come in, or a woman as president, and suddenly change everything. It's going to be much bigger dynamics, and they're going to take a longer time to show success.
Aida, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how Joe Biden is perceived in Israel-Palestine, how you think he's perceived on the right, how he's perceived by people who care about Palestinian rights. What is the perception of him? What's the debate about his campaign and prospective presidency on the ground?
Well, first of all, thank you, Peter, and I'm always glad to meet you all. Also, Matt and Lara. Of course, I mean, when you look from far away to what is happening in the United States and to the different, let's say, campaigns that were led, it looks like sometimes what we are feeling here exactly what was when we were campaigning for the election and we only wanted to see that Netanyahu is not going to be a prime minister. It looks from over here for us, people who really want to find a solution to the situation in the region and understand how any president who will be elected at this crucial time, not only in what's concerning our region, but also what's happening in the United States and in the world in general. We want to see someone who is able at least to be less damaging than the, what we have today as the President of the United States, Mr. Trump. It's understood by us that, of course, Biden is not having a very clear vision, as Lara put it, or is vocal and focusing on the Palestinian-Israeli issue, or is going to lead a real a clear policy that will lead to support ending the occupation or establishing a Palestinian state. But at least we know for sure, at least till now, he is not showing the same policy that is unlimitedly supporting Netanyahu's government and his plans. We know for sure that at least the bases who are going to vote for Biden are bases who want to see a different policy than what is existing today toward the Palestinian-Israeli issue. At least those are people, I'm not saying sharing the same vision with me, but at least they want to see a political agreement and everything will be solved through negotiations and not through annexation or extending what is called, in order to make it less or nicer, extended sovereignty of Israeli sovereignty over Palestinian occupied land. So we are realistic. We understand that we might have an ability to speak at least with Biden a little bit more than we are able to do with Mr. Trump. We are expecting, actually, from Mr. Biden, at least from analyzing the situation, we understand that the annexation decision is very much in the hands of Netanyahu, but more also in the hands of the American administration today and Trump's. And I understood that this week there will be a decision made, or at least consultations are going on there, if to give the green line to Netanyahu or not. We want an administration, we want a president who is able at least to stop this deterioration by saying, wait, we are not giving you the green light. We are not expecting someone who is going to bring us salvation. We have to be clear about it. I think that it showed in the history of many people that, first of all, it's up to those who are suffering from the situation, mainly the Palestinian people, struggle against it with the solidarity, and of course the Israeli citizens who believe that occupation is ruining their life and endangering their lives, and with the solidarity of all democratic and left-wing forces all over the world, and especially in the United States. We hope that we understand that the Palestinian-Israeli issue is not the core and the main issue on the agenda in the elections, but something different happened this time, and especially by the campaign led by Mr. Sanders, that suddenly the discourse around the Palestinian-Israeli situation or problem has evolved and has been put forward in the front of the stage, let's say, a little bit more than in the past. And it challenged the mainstream discourse, American mainstream discourse about it, especially a Jewish American discourse.
Thank you very much for that. I noticed an interesting analogy there, potentially between Joe Biden and Benny Gantz, as perhaps people whose main appeal, perhaps to many progressives, is simply that they're not the other guy. But I wanted to remind folks who are listening that you can ask questions in the Q&A, and we will. I'll endeavor to get to some of those later. Lara, I wanted to just ask you a little bit to talk about Biden's comments on annexation during the campaign and on Israel-Palestine more generally. You encourage us to take seriously what his advisors have said. He presumably, and I wonder whether you think his statements about annexation have been adequate, and how you and in general how you would describe the kind of the tenor of his campaign's discourse on Israel-Palestine so far.
So I'm going to approach answering this with humility, from the fact that I am outside of the campaign, I am outside of the political process, I am a kibitzer on this process, and it's very easy for me as a kibitzer to say, come on, Israel is on the verge of annexing and all you can do is express concern and warn that it'll be bad for Israel. I mean, can't you say more than that? On the other hand, I think, if I were sitting next to Mr. Biden, advising him right now, and we don't know yet what Israel is going to do, how big the annexation will be, where it will be, how they will articulate it, do I want to be going out on a limb in advance, making threats, drawing red lines, or do I want to hold my fire until I know more? Again, me sitting where I sit says, by not coming out more strongly, you are enabling an outcome, which you will then have to deal with after the fact, and I find that deeply disturbing. On the other hand, if I were sitting next to him, I would say this is a desperate moment in political history, and the stakes are incredibly high. And anyone who has worked in US politics knows that going out on a limb on Israel-Palestine ends up taking over a huge amount of your campaign's energy and political capital. And unless you genuinely, like we saw with Mr. Sanders, are prepared to stake out really meaningful, thoughtful positioning and make that a hallmark of your campaign, if you're not ready to do that, then it's not something you're going to want to talk about too much, because if you go out on a limb, it will take everything. It will take over everything. I will say, though, the failure of folks on the progressive side to articulate clearly, not just simply that they are worried, or not just that they think, as if they have no dog in this fight. They observe, I care about Israel and this will be bad for Israel. If that's the strongest thing you can say right now, as Israel is on the verge of annexing, then you have to understand that your positioning is enabling Israel to move forward. You're essentially guaranteeing that you're going to have to deal with an outcome which is going to force you to either say, okay, we'll acquiesce to you doing this, or we're going to be in a very oppositional place. And that is incredibly unfortunate. I do wish the Biden campaign could figure out some stronger positioning. And I don't know, on balance, again, I'm not a political person in this sense, whether they are genuinely better off waiting until after Israel does something and formulating what their response will be. I tend to think that is a more defensive position than owning a policy and defending it after something happens. But we'll see.
Matt, you said in your opening comment something I found very intriguing that I wanted you to ask you to elaborate a little bit on. You mentioned the way in which there were kind of payoffs to the Saudis and maybe other Gulf states as a kind of compensation for the Iran deal, and that thus people in Yemen paid the price. And you raised the specter, which I hadn't heard actually before, but once you said it, makes a certain worrying kind of sense that there could be a way in which re-entering the Iran deal, that the Biden administration felt it had to make some kind of payment to Israel for that could come at the Palestinians' expense. I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit on what that might look like, sure, and why it's a cause for concern.
Right. I mean, I think, basically, where we are right now, and I think what Lara said about, where this issue fits into the larger kind of presidential debate right now is right, but also in terms of, I think, regional issues, The issue of Palestine, the occupation, has fallen down a number of rungs because of other regional crises, a lot of them, in fact, stemming from the Iraq War. So I think even if you were, even as someone who's supportive of Palestinian rights, were to look at, okay, where do we want the U.S. to focus its time and energy and political and diplomatic capital, you know, this picture has shifted. But I think, you know, what I mean is, you know, in order to, you know, expecting there will still be a Netanyahu government in Israel in January 2020, when a Biden administration seeks to re-enter the deal and work with regional partners and allies and clients in order to get them, if, you know, either to support or at least not openly oppose their initiatives, then agreeing to kind of sideline or downplaying or tamp down you know, the issue of Palestinian rights and ending the occupation. You know, it seemed this is a natural place for, you know, for Washington foreign policy types to land on, okay, here's the payoff. But I did want to just kind of echo, if I could, something Aida said about, you know, what, you know, again, if we're in a glass half full space here, it is worth recognizing, you know, that with Biden, you know, let's understand what the Trump project is, the Trump Netanyahu project here. It is to just destroy the Palestinians as an independent political entity. That is the project. Whatever nonsense op-eds Ron Derma will write, you know, using the words two states, or whatever they'll tell, you know, people in English while telling, you know, other people things in other languages, that is the project, to remove the Palestinians from the international stage as independent political actors and to reduce them to just a disenfranchised minority inside greater Israel. That is not a vision Joe Biden shares. Joe Biden and his team recognize the Palestinians as a people with legitimate claims and rights on this land. And that's something we can work with and we must work with.
Aida, I wanted to go to you. I think one of the challenges that those of us who want the Biden administration to try to take some more proactive and progressive kind of efforts on this face is not only the domestic political challenges of doing that, but also the sense that the Biden administration comes in with a series of just really daunting problems. I mean, right, Trump will have essentially wrecked so much stuff that just trying to, you know, dig the United States out from under that will be an enormous undertaking domestically and internationally. If you had the opportunity to talk to former Vice President Biden, and I dearly hope that you do, and to make the case for him that it is worth expending American energy in a productive way, in a progressive way, in pursuit of justice and peace in Israel-Palestine, that it's in America's interest to do that. What would be the case that you would make?
Well, first of all, I hope also that I will have the opportunity to do that, to deliver the message. Well, first of all, I think there were some steps taken by the United States administration and President Trump that really damaged the relation with the Palestinian people and damaged the whole process that we were hoping it's going to continue and maybe bring us some peace and bring us to a situation where a real Palestinian independent state will be established. Those steps should be taken back, I think. One of the rebuilding confidence and giving hope to the Palestinian people that this time maybe the United States will have a different role in what is happening in our region. First of all, there were the steps. For example, I think the clear position from the deal of the century, what is called the deal of the century, or peace and prosperity plan that was delivered by the current administration should be very clear and should be clear that no commitment is made or is going to be continued. Second, I think that the fact that the offices, and I'm building here on what Matt had said that Biden do not share the vision of excluding or kicking out the Palestinians from the international arena. So maybe starting from bringing them back to Washington, where the offices of the NPA were closed down and the representatives were sent away from Washington. I think that also bringing to the knowledge of the Israeli government that none of the steps that are violating international law can be tolerated in this very crucial timing when we are talking about a process that will end the occupation. And if those steps, like the annexation, that or parts of it, that is, and I agree, nobody understands till now or knows how much geographically or legally this annexation will be. It might start in mild steps and it gradually goes. But any step that will be taken before, and here I'm giving a fact, before Biden gets into the White House, I think it will be needed to not recognize them and not to accept those steps of annexation, whatever, how big they are going to be, if it is big areas or only 1 or 2 settlements, or it's going to be by law, or it's going to be by decision of the government. In any case or in any shape, these steps that violate the international law and the international conventions should be not accepted by. This is the minimum. In my opinion, I always wanted and hoped for international involvement and in the situation in the region, and not only one-sided by the United States or any other country, but it should be a kind of international or sponsorship of any kind of agreement that will be in the future. But on the other hand, I think that empowering and bringing more and more the voice of the Palestinian people and the narrative of the Palestinian people into the international arena, it will be crucial after all these last 2-3 years of aggressive silencing of the needs of the Palestinian people and the let's say the image that was built in the last 3 or 4 years about the Palestinians.
Lara, you know more about the levers of U.S. policymaking towards Israel-Palestine than almost anybody I know, in terms of the kind of menu of different things that the United States could do. If you had the opportunity to talk to President Biden, you know, or let's say, you know, assuming he gets to that place, or President-elect Biden, let's say that becomes clear. You know, anything he wants to do that would be constructive from a progressive perspective will have political pushback. But, you know, in the whole kind of menu of different things that potentially he could do, from military aid to diplomatic efforts to efforts at the UN to simply trying to roll back things that Trump has done on Jerusalem or other things, where would you suggest might be some places to think about starting?
It's a great question, and part of it is a creative writing or creative thinking exercise, and part of it is a sort of, you know, going through the books and seeing what is legally possible. So, for instance, Aida's suggestion of reopening the PLO mission in Washington, which I think is a fantastic idea, but would actually require change in law. It's not possible under current circumstances. We have a law dating back to 1987, which says that unless basically that there's a law that doesn't have a waiver that forbids the PLO from operating in the U.S. It is under that law that the Trump administration ejected the PLO from Washington. And historically, we only had a mission because Congress allowed a waiver. That waiver, starting in the Obama years, was massively conditioned. And at this point, the Palestinians don't meet the conditions. So that would require a change in law, or it would require some, creative workaround. I've heard people talking about, wow, what if after annexation, a new Biden presidency recognized the state of Palestine? And that's an interesting creative thinking exercise. My read of most U.S. law attacking the Palestinians is that recognizing the state of Palestine wouldn't circumvent the law, because it usually talks about the PLO and any successor entity or organization such like that. So I think there's limits on what's possible, and it requires some reimagining. But I do think that the intent is what's really here. If the intent is to demonstrate that the U.S. recognizes the legitimacy of a Palestinian people and the legitimacy of Palestinian rights to self-determination and to seek a state of their own and all of that, that there's all sorts of interesting ways that can be pursued. And whether that's a matter of trying to find new and creative ways to provide assistance, bearing in mind that at this point, again, there's US law. The Taylor Force Act will exist long after Mr. Trump leaves office, if he leaves office, unless Congress changes it. And that actually blocks most assistance. But it does leave areas of new assistance. If the US decides to become much more engaged at a direct level, engaging Palestinian people. I know there's people on the call who are engaged very much in the people-to-people stuff, which is not something I've had in historically much enthusiasm for, but I recognize one of the failures of US policy for years is that we've engaged at the political level and not at the popular level. And a new administration could come in and shift focus that way. Another way that would make a significant difference is if the US administration, and this would be unprecedented, actually encouraged, welcomed international engagement on Israel-Palestine, instead of saying to countries that have as much of a stake in Israel-Palestine as anybody else, like the European Union, which is Israel's largest trading partner, instead of saying, listen, stay back, don't do anything except take your direction from us, and instead said, yes, do what you're going to do. We're with you. We're looking to be supportive. We're not going to sanction you if you do decide to look after your own interests and, I don't know, defend international law. I think there are ways that they can engage. Again, this is going to be mainly a creative thinking exercise and a test of how much political courage, because every single thing they do in this will be faced with that political courage question. And I'll tell you, honestly, I've gotten calls from people who are working on these things today saying, remind me, before Obama, did any US president in history ever vote against Israel at the UN Security Council? And I want to tear my hair out, because this came up in the Obama era, this mythology that nobody had ever gone against Israel at the UN Security Council. I actually did all the research. I published my research. I published an op-ed in the New York Times. And yet again, with a new presidential candidate, we're again having the question of, would it be an unprecedented betrayal to consider, saying something Israel didn't like at the UN Security Council, when every president before Obama did it multiple times. Obama was unprecedented in that at 8 years, he only did it once. So some of that is a question of political will and not looking for excuses not to do something.
Matt, you are back in Congress, historically, as you know, Congress has tended to be to the right of American presidents on Israel-Palestine. I wonder what you think where you think the center of gravity is among Democrats in Congress today, and what you think that Congress could do in the Biden era to be helpful and productive, and what we should worry about in terms of things that Congress could do that might actually even box Biden in from preventing even kind of mildly progressive movement.
Right. No, I think, yes, everything you said is right, but I do think we see this changing in some ways. We see, not going to get into specifics, but certain members being primaried by much more progressive candidates, and this issue playing a part. And I think that's important, because I also want to use this to kind of connect it to something I was saying before. I mean, we talked about the priority of the issue of Palestine in a Biden administration's regional approach, but I would also say that one thing Biden has talked about, and Democrats are talking more about, including congressional Democrats, is this need to kind of reaccredit American support for human rights. I think there's always been an inconsistency in American support for human rights. We don't need to go into that, but this has been, this is not a problem that began with Trump, but as with so many other issues, Trump has just said, the quiet part loud, and been completely blatant about the double standard he holds for human rights in some countries and overlooking it in other countries. But I think toward this project of reaccrediting United States support for human rights, the Palestine issue is one place where that support has long been extremely inconsistent. So, I mean, this doesn't necessarily argue for any particular set of tools, but I think it does create, it's an opportunity to lay out a set of principles, not only for leaders, but also for people in the grassroots, for people who advocate and lobby Congress. And I think connecting it to the larger discussion that's going on right now, not only in foreign policy, but obviously in our streets over the past few weeks. Black Lives Matter as a concept, not just for how we have to change American society and address some of the inequalities in our own society, but also as we think about American foreign policy and what are the values and interests that we want to kind of promote and actualize around the world.
We have a lot of great questions, including quite a few by folks that themselves have done really important, thinking and writing on this issue. So I really appreciate people weighing in. We can't get to all of them, but I'm going to try to take some of the concepts in some of these and kind of turn them into questions. Ida, one of the questions is, Ida, are you still here? Somehow I feel like you have I don't see you on my screen. Looks like we may have lost Ida for a minute. I hope she will, she'll come back to us. So let me go then, Lara, to you. One question that we got was about Biden's foreign policy team, and whether, who are the important players, and whether you see a kind of a range of perspectives among the people that would have the most influence on him. And I wonder if, Laura, if you can just talk a little bit about the circle around candidate Biden.
So I don't know that much about the people who are most, obviously Tony Blinken is there, Bill Burns is acting as a surrogate. The bottom line, as I look at what's coming out of the campaign so far, is that Mr. Biden knows this policy personally. I don't think this is a candidate who is looking to a circle of people to tell him what to say and what to think. He knows what the issues are. He knows what the donors care about. He knows what the people he cares about most in the party are concerned about. He knows which boxes he wants to tick when he speaks on this. I think the bigger question will be, if elected, who he brings in and how much he listens to them. I'm not going to go optimistic or pessimistic here. I'm going to say that if he is elected and he comes into office with a sea change on the ground in terms of annexation, I think that I would be, guardedly more hopeful that he'll bring in people who are not just status quo thinkers, thinking about how can we just keep articulating the same things we've always said and not spend political capital. I think that's harder to do. It's harder to populate your administration that way after annexation. So we'll see. But I think at this point, what we're basically getting from the campaign is Mr. Biden with pretty mainstream talking points of the old school Democratic Party, which doesn't want to rock the boat on this. And I'll just add, speaking to what Matt just talked about, I think the most interesting element of what's going on here politically is not in the presidential campaign, it's in the down ballot campaigns. What we're seeing in more than one primary right now is a real growth of open debate around Israel-Palestine. And even if those primary challengers don't win, it's going to have to impact the thinking of the people who are having to fight back against them, because what they're saying, even if a down ballot, even if a challenger doesn't win on, I am going to be, a challenger who is more progressive in Israel-Palestine doesn't win in the primary, the person they're seeking to primary knows that they're having to spend a lot of political capital defending their policy on this, and they're going to take that back to Washington with them. So either way, I think those sort of changes in Congress mitigate in favor of potentially more creative thinking from the Biden administration if elected. We'll see.
I think we're lucky to have Aida back with us. Aida, thank you for coming back. I think you're still on mute, but I wanted to ask you a question that came up in the Q&A, and that has to do with what progressive Americans can do here to have an impact on American policymaking. And so I asked you what you would say to President Biden, but since I don't think he's watching this, I do think we have a couple of hundred people, many of whom who are watching this, who actually are people who would like to move American policy in a progressive direction. And I wonder what you would say to them about what they can do.
Well, when I spoke before, I said that we would like to see a solidarity from different groups that are supporting our fight here, our struggle in order to try to avoid the annexation. And not only the annexation and our fight, sometimes you are focusing as if the only problem we have now is annexation. We keep forgetting that the root of all the problems is the continuous occupation, and that's what we need to do. So one of the things that can be done toward putting pressure on the American administration or decision makers in the United States, of course, I think that campaign pressure, especially now that you are facing elections and you are going to decide who will be your decision makers in the next area. I think this is very important. Trying also to bring the message to more and more people and convince more people. I visited many times the United States, and I met different people who are involved politically. Sometimes we keep talking to each other and we think that the whole citizens of the United States are worried about the situation or are dealing with it with the extensivity we do. But it's not. I met Americans who do not know anything about the situation in the region, in the Middle East, or between Israel and Palestine, or they don't know that there is occupation still going on, and they think that there are maybe war between two states. It's very important to bring the knowledge, understanding, and try to change the reality also on the decision-making level in the Congress. And now we are addressing the congressmen with a letter asking them to be more aware of the dangerous sides of the annexation and try to put an end to it. But I think it's very important also to try to affect the decision makers here by saying very clearly that there are different groups in the United States or in the world who will never accept these violations, who are not willing to normalize with such policies, and that there is a price that will be paid by the Israeli government if it continue with this kind of policy that endanger the two people of the region, and mainly the Palestinian people, that blocks any possibility for a future peace. I think this, especially when it comes from the United States, where, as I said before, there is unlimited support for Israel and mainly to the Israeli government. And if it is financial aid, if it is militaristic aid, or if it is even, by taking positions and providing more moral support for the idea. I think if this government in Israel do not understand that it might lose of some, at least, of that support on the different levels, nothing will make either Netanyahu or Gantz, his partner now, who is totally, in my opinion, not able to do anything when it comes to annexation. That's at least what the coalition agreement has said very clearly. He is able to make a veto on any issue in Israel except the issue of annexation. It is accepted from this right of veto given to Gantz. If they don't understand that there will be a price for the annexation, and not only the ordinary people, the Israeli people and the Palestinian people will pay that price, but there will be a price paid by the government, if it is moral or financial. I think they will never think twice before implementing.
Matt, I wanted to go to you. You remember well the debates, the struggle over the Democratic platform back in 2016. I think it's fair to say the Democratic platform on Israel-Palestine was not as progressive as many of us might like to hope. If I remember correctly, it didn't even include the word occupation. Do you, what do you think we can hope for out of the Democratic platform this year? And do you think it will be any better?
Well, yeah, I do think it will be better. I think we will have to confront some of those same arguments about, well, we don't want to use words like occupation, that, and I think we see the product. I mean, that kind of aversion to that word occupation, which is in fact not an inflammatory or controversial word at all. It's a legal term that applies to the occupied territory without question. But I think that hesitance and that aversion to using this kind of clear and honest language has consequences. And I think that is something that is understood by a lot more Democrats these days. I think I would point to a letter that came out probably about a month ago now by a number of former Obama administration officials, including some older officials like former Ambassador Dan Kurtzer, Ambassador Martin Indyk, but also importantly, a number of younger administration officials. I mean, that is the kind of future, foreign policy establishment of the Democratic Party, making some very, I think, bold and clear, demands on what the Democratic Party platform should say with regard to Palestinian rights and ending the occupation. So yeah, I think for the reasons that Lara ably laid out, there will be an effort, I think, from some of the more establishment voices to say, all right, we don't want to get into this. But I do think there's going to be a much stronger effort this time around to say, no, listen, the Democratic Party needs to speak much more clearly and frankly about issues of human rights and values on every issue. And we can no longer accept that there is a special, category for this one issue in which we must be silent. And I think that is the kind of approach that you're seeing. It's like, it's not that we're singling any country out. We are in fact ending a double standard on this issue when we treat Palestinian human rights as just the same rights that every human being deserves.
Lara, I wanted to go to you. Ida was talking about what Americans could do at the grassroots level. And one of the issues that you have worked on a lot, I think have been really kind of the leading voice on, is the whole question of efforts in Congress and in state legislatures to criminalize various kinds of activities that would be involved in putting pressure on Israel. And we have a set of questions which kind of are connected to that a little bit. I wonder how you think that's would likely play out in a Biden administration, if you see new efforts that might come through at Congress that would try to restrict the free speech rights of people who want to pressure Israel over its policies, and whether you think there's any prospect that some of what's already been done might be rolled back, whether that's law or just administrative action that the Trump administration has taken.
Yeah, this is look, there are trends here that are running. They have their own momentum. They have their own backers. They are outside the Trump administration. They certainly have the support of the Trump administration, but they started long before Trump came into office. Where things are right now, and for folks who aren't, obsessed with this the way I am, what Peter is talking about are the legislation at the state level that effectively penalizes those who engage in boycotts of Israel or settlements. Almost every one of these laws conflates Israel with settlements and says that if you engage in boycotts of either, you cannot have contracts with the state, which is illegal. That's an unconstitutional condition. There's no guarantee that you can have contracts with the state, but you can't be banned from having contracts with the state based on demanding that you give up free speech as a condition. And some of those have been actually challenged in court, and in court that the unconstitutionality has been upheld to the extent that now we have a new trend of either amending or preemptively amending these laws before they're introduced so that they are narrower. So they're harder to challenge. It's harder to find someone to challenge it, because even if someone ends up potentially hurt by this law, they don't want to have a public case in court as a company saying, listen, I want to defend, while I'm being called an anti-Semite, I want to defend my behavior. And the anti-Semitism I raise because that is, I think, the most important new direction this is going. And I don't know how this will play out under a Biden administration. Mr. Trump's executive order on anti-Semitism, which had nothing to do with actual lethal anti-Semitism growing across this country. That order was framed specifically to clamp down on criticism of Israel and to frame it as anti-Semitic so you could clamp down on it. And that is part of a trend which we are seeing across Europe, and we're seeing it in US states, which is to define to define criticism of Israel, boycotts of Israel, activism targeting Israel as anti-Semitic, and then effectively delegitimize it and call it discriminatory and make it illegal, if not criminal. I mean, to make it illegitimate, if not criminal. And that, I think, has tremendous momentum, because the only way to fight back on that is to actually say, no, it's not anti-Semitism. And then people say, why are you defending anti-Semitism? And there are very few politicians who are willing to go to the mat. Some will say, listen, it's like with BDS, the best defense you'll hear from a lot of politicians is, this is terrible, I hate it, it's awful, but it's free speech. That's a crappy defense of free speech. Legal, non-violent, time-tested, time and long-respected modes of opposing political views that, of challenging political views are being deemed irredeemably evil if they're used to challenge Israel. To the point where, one could argue there is no way to concretely challenge Israeli policy, right? If you go to the UN, it's diplomatic terror. Obviously, violence is not acceptable. Diplomatic terror, we have journalistic terror, we have, if you do boycotts, it's economic terror. And if you criticize Israel or oppose Zionism, we're now being called anti-Semites. So, and I don't know how the Biden administration will contend with that. I would hope that they will just take a step back and say, free speech matters, and this is unacceptable, and we won't be part of this. That certainly isn't what we've heard from the campaign so far, which has just joined in, again, checking the rhetorical box of, BDS is bad and we will do everything possible to fight back on this delegitimization of Israel.
Right. In fact, I think I saw a quote recently by a top Biden advisor who essentially said that in opposing BDS, Biden was showing that he would oppose the anti-Semitism of the left and the right, which is essentially to equate the BDS movement with the kind of white nationalists that, that have shot people in synagogues. We're running out of time. I want to ask one more question to Matt and then give Aida the closing word. And I want to end on a slightly personal note for both of you, since I find you both unusually courageous people. So Matt, the first is I want to ask you, is a question about Washington. So I'm sure you know as well as I do, in fact, better than I do, that there are a great many people who work on foreign policy in Washington who have desires to hold high administration office, who speak differently about this issue publicly and privately, and who feel that to say publicly what they think privately might be the end of their chances of high office. You are not one of those people. You are a kind of a striking, almost unicorn-like exception in some ways. And I just wanted to ask you what you have learned and what advice you would give for other people who want to work in democratic foreign policy, who want to actually be able to have the courage of their convictions.
Wow, well, thank you for that. I think, and this is something I talk to, as I'm sure all of you do, but I talk to young aspiring foreign policy analysts and writers, whenever asked, because people did that same kindness for me when I was just starting out. And one thing I'll always say is, like, just think through your own values and principles now, because you will be given choices all along the way to shade those principles or betray those principles or take the easy way out. So just think through very seriously where your lines are, because the way that the system in Washington is set up is to give you rewards to cross those lines. And again, I don't want to kind of paint I'm where I am because I've had the support and assistance and guidance of a lot of brave people, one of them being Lara. I could name so many others, but I think that's just what I'd say. And I think that's changing the more that the more unicorns there are out here in the wild wandering around, the more people will understand that you can tell the truth and still have a career.
Aida, I want to end with you. Obviously, the question that many have in the United States among progressives in the wake of annexation, with the prospect of annexation, is for how long Palestinians will continue to officially ask as a national movement for two states, when it has become so abundantly clear to so many people that Israel, with the support of the United States, has no interest in allowing Palestinians to have a viable sovereign state. I know that the Joint List and Hadash have historically supported two states. I wonder if I could just ask you to talk personally about how you see the vision of two states right now as we are on the precipice of annexation, and whether you think it's time to, there are other models for justice and peace that people should start thinking about.
Well, we have two options. What is existing today is actually that the Israeli government, led by Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu, says very clearly, obviously, that they don't want a viable and independent Palestinian state that is able to have sovereignty over the lands of 1967. But we have two options: either to stick into what the Palestinian people have been struggling for years, is to have the right of self-determination, or just to say, well, the plans of Mr. Netanyahu have succeeded, and there is a new reality that the game now is back to be played the way that actually Netanyahu decided, is to create a one state, and it is an apartheid state. If there will be annexation and there will be no possibility for creating a Palestinian state, there will be a big Israel state, but it will be an apartheid state. And that means that we are demanding the Palestinian people to give up their right of self-determination and create an liberation from occupation, and starting as a civil movement asking for their right to vote and to be elected. And as a Palestinian who is citizen of Israel and have the right to vote and to be elected, but still not an equal citizen, I think it's not fair to ask the Palestinian people who have been struggling for a long time to be liberated from occupation to give up their national dream and just to co-op with the new situation and reality created actually by those who are violating the international law, who are willing to live forever in a war situation led by Mr. Netanyahu. This is not fair, and I think it should not be this way. I know that this window is closing, And we have to be very active now to try to avoid this situation, but this is the reality.
Well, on that sobering note, thank you so much, Member of Knesset Aida Touma-Sliman, Matt Duss, Lara Friedman, and all of you for taking part. Please keep an eye open for future conversations that we'll be holding at Jewish Currents. Thanks very much.